The Singer Manufacturing Company built a clock tower in Clydebank that you could see for miles. 200 feet of red brick and sandstone, 4 faces, each one wide enough to swallow a room. Every morning before the gates opened, before the machine started, before the smell of oil and timber and fresh-cut metal drifted across the town, you could look up and read the time. The whole of Clydebank could read it. The clock told the workers when to arrive. It told them when to leave. For nearly 80 years, it was the heartbeat of one of the most important factories in British industrial history, the Singer Manufacturing Company, Kilbowie, Clydebank, the largest sewing machine factory ever built. At its peak, 16,000 people passed through its gates every working day. It produced 1 in every 3 sewing machines sold anywhere on Earth. Clydebank was, in every meaningful sense, a company town. Its streets, its rhythms, its reason for existing shaped by a single employer. Ships did not define this stretch of the Clyde. This factory did. Then one morning in 1963, 17 years before the factory itself closed, they took the clock tower down. Brick by brick, face by face, until nothing remained but the sky where it had been. The symbol went before the substance. That is where this story begins. Isaac Singer did not invent the sewing machine. That distinction belongs to earlier inventors, and the patent disputes with Elias Howe, who held the foundational sewing machine patent, defined the industry's legal battles for a decade before Singer emerged dominant. What Isaac Singer did was refine it, patent his own improvements, market it, and turn it into the defining domestic appliance of the Victorian age. By the 1860s, Singer's New York factory could no longer keep pace with orders flowing in from Britain and Europe. The answer was obvious: build in Britain. A Scot named George Ross Mackenzie served as Singer's man in Europe. He had crossed the Atlantic, built a career inside an American company, and in 1867 he brought Singer back across the ocean and into Glasgow. The first factory occupied rented premises in Love Lone, then a larger site at Bridgeton. Then, in 1882, Mackenzie broke ground on 46 acres of flat land at Kilbowie, just west of Glasgow, on the south bank of the Clyde. The factory that opened in 1884 was not merely large. By several accounts, it was the largest sewing machine factory ever constructed, rivaling any American factory of its era in scale and output. 7,000 workers in the first full year of operation, producing 13,000 machines every week. Raw materials entered at one end. Finished machines came out the other. Steel for the mechanisms, wood for the cabinets, thread for the demonstrations, every component cut, shaped, and assembled within these walls. Singer laid its own internal railway, 4 miles of track threading between departments like a nervous system. It built its own power station, its own water supply, its own fire brigade. When the workforce grew large enough that the daily journey from Glasgow became impractical, the Caledonian Railway opened Singer Station in 1907. Its platforms sitting inside the factory boundary, trains running directly from the city centre to the gates. One of only 2 railway stations in Britain named after a factory, and Singer Station still operates today, more than 40 years after the last machine left the line. Still growing, still producing, still pulling half of Clydebank through its gates every morning. By 1913, the Kilbowie factory operated at a scale without parallel in its industry anywhere on Earth. That year, Singer's Clydebank Works turned out more than 1.3 million sewing machines. Over the course of its full operational life, the factory would produce tens of millions of machines, a total output that placed it among the most prolific single manufacturing sites of the industrial age. The factory claimed to supply 80% of all sewing machines sold worldwide. The complex sprawled across nearly 1 million square feet. The machines built here reached homes and workshops on every continent. Clydebank itself had grown up around Singer. its economy calibrated to the factory, its rhythms set by the same clock that rose above the roofline. When Singer was busy, Clydebank was busy. The brass band, the rifle club, the swimming team, the choral society, and the dramatic group were all Singer institutions, funded by the company for its people. Workers' families lived in Singer's shadow, in streets that Singer's presence had made possible. Then the war came. 2 years before that production peak, in 1911, 12 women in the cabinet polishing department put down their tools. Their workload had increased, their wages had not. They walked out, and by the following morning, 10,000 workers had joined them, some accounts putting the number as high as 11,500. The factory stopped. The 1911 Singer strike is now recognized as a founding moment of Red Clydeside, the labour movement that would define Scottish industrial politics for the following generation. The strike reflected something wider than wage grievances. The introduction of scientific management principles, what would later be formalized as Taylorism, had reorganized the production lines in ways that increased output, while fragmenting the workers' control over their own labor. They understood the cost before the economists named it. Singer's management wrote to every worker individually. The message carried one clear meaning: return or transfer. The strike collapsed within a fortnight. The women went back. Nothing formally changed, but something in the relationship between the company and its people had shifted in a way that would not shift back. Then the wider war arrived, and Singer's machines gave way to different work entirely. Munitions, fuses, landmines, rifle components, aircraft parts. The factory that had clothed the world's domestic interiors now fed the Western Front. Women filled the production lines where men had been stationed. The clock kept its time above it all. In March 1941, the Luftwaffe came to Clydebank across 2 nights of sustained attack, the Clydebank Blitz, that killed more than 500 civilians in the town. Singer was a target. Several factory buildings were destroyed. 39 Singer workers were among those who did not come home. When daylight returned, the town was barely standing, and the factory lay damaged beyond quick repair. Singer rebuilt, Clydebank rebuilt. But 1913 was already receding into history, and the numbers would never return to what they had been. After the Second War, Singer made a decision that appeared rational at the time and proved ruinous across the following decades. The company invested in new factories, not in Clydebank, but in Europe and Asia, in countries where labor costs ran lower, where land was cheaper, where governments extended incentives. The Kilbowie plant, engineered for the 19th century, kept producing machines, but the world had reorganized itself around it. This was Britain's deindustrialization, arriving not as a sudden event, but as a slow logic, applied factory by factory across the post-war decades. The workforce peaked at 16,000 in the early 1960s. Then the slide began, quiet at first. A few hundred fewer workers each year. Lines consolidated, departments folded into each other, the internal railway falling into disuse. By the mid-1960s, the clock tower was already rubble, demolished in 1963, while the factory was still close to the height of its employment. A strange decision, a premonition written in brick and stone. By 1970, the workforce had fallen from 16,000 to just 6,400. By 1978, Singer proposed cutting the remaining staff to 2,000. The rationale followed the same logic applied to every such reduction in those years: consolidation, efficiency, global restructuring. The Clydebank plant was the wrong size in the wrong place at the wrong price. Consider what had already been surrendered before the gates finally closed. The station still ran. The streets were still there. The people who had given their working lives to this place still lived in the town, still watching. But the thing that had made the town what it was had been diminishing for 20 years before anyone made a formal announcement. The announcement arrived in October 1979. Singer was closing the Kilbowie factory as part of what the company described as a program to restructure, consolidate, and streamline its manufacturing and marketing operations. The language was precise. The effect was not. Clydebank had already lost its shipyards. The John Brown Yard, where the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth had been built, the Marathon Yard, the others that had once lined this bank of the Clyde, were gone or reduced beyond recognition. Singer had been the remaining anchor. Now that too was being pulled up. Closure was confirmed for June 1980. The final machines came off the line. Workers who had spent 30 years in the same department walked out for the last time. Some families had sent 3 generations through Singer's gates. The station built specifically for the factory still stood. The train still stopped at its platform, but the reason for its existence had vanished. The Scottish Development Agency bought the site. The old factory buildings came down. In their place rose a business park. Singer itself took an office in the new development. 6 employees, where 16,000 had once stood. Not one machine made in Clydebank again. Here is what the numbers can say. In 1913, more than 1.3 million sewing machines left this factory. In 1885, 7,000 workers produced 13,000 machines every week. At its height, the Kilbowie works covered nearly 1 million square feet, and its output touched every corner of the inhabited world. Here is what the numbers cannot say. What it felt like to step through one of those gates on a January morning when the Clyde ran cold and the lights inside were already burning. What it meant to be the 3rd generation of your family working the same line. What the women in Department 47, the motor department, known among the workforce as the beauty parlor, thought about their work, their colleagues, their days. What it cost to walk out for the last time and look back at a building that had framed your entire life. The 1911 strikers understood something about cost. 12 women who asked for fair treatment in return for a fair day's work, whose strike failed, whose names were not recorded with the care that the production figures were recorded. But the production figures stopped in 1980. The names are still the names. Singer demolished its own clock tower in 1963. Let that stand as the true turning point, not the announcement in 1979, not the final day in 1980. The moment the company chose to remove the most visible mark of its own presence from the Clydebank skyline, while the workforce was still more or less intact, while the machines were still running, while the trains were still pulling into the station each morning. One explanation, and a compelling one, holds that what happened at Kilbowie was not a local failure but a structural one, repeated across British industry in the post-war decades. The factory had been engineered for a world in which Clydebank was the logical place to make sewing machines for Europe and beyond. By the 1960s, that logic had dissolved. New plants in Germany, France, Japan, and Taiwan could produce the same machines more cheaply, and the company followed the logic of its costs. The workers of Clydebank bore the consequence. A second explanation holds that Singer's decision to spread production across multiple international facilities, rather than investing in the modernization of the Kilbowie works, was a choice driven by short-term financial calculation that destroyed a long-term industrial asset. Both explanations may carry truth simultaneously. The clock tower had already been taken down. The question of who decided to take it down and why remains worth sitting with. Stand at Singer Station today and the trains still stop. The platform is still there, still carrying the name, still connecting this part of Clydebank to the city, more than 40 years after the last Singer machine was assembled on the other side of the fence. It is one of the stranger remnants in British industrial history, a railway station that outlived the factory it was built to serve, still running, still named, still open. The factory buildings are gone, demolished in stages across the late 1980s and 1990s. Clydebank Business Park occupies part of the land. The Singer archive, production records, machine models, corporate documents sits in the care of West Dunbartonshire Council, designated a collection of national significance. There are photographs of the clock tower. There are recorded testimonies from the workers. There are machines, still functional, still bearing the Singer name, manufactured in Clydebank in the years when this town stood at the center of the world's sewing machine trade. The Singer brand itself survives, attached to machines now produced in China. The name travels the world without the place that once gave it meaning. That too is a kind of testament. In 1913, this factory turned out more than 1.3 million machines in a single year. By the time the last one left the building, that number belonged to ancient history. The clock that had measured every working life in Clydebank for nearly 8 decades had already been gone for 17 years. The factory followed where the symbol led. Look at the sky above Kilbowie now, and there is nothing where the tower stood. 200 feet of brick and 4 wide faces, gone since 1963. The trains still stop. The name is still there. The rest is silence and a business park, and 40 years of asking what might have been done differently. Still running, still named, still standing where the factory once stood. That is what remains of the thing that was Singer.